I'm Barry, and welcome to Rusty Nail and Friends, where children and grown-ups can enjoy a quiet story together. The Quivering Whiskers episode. When a lonely little valve spring wandered into the garden shed, who could possibly imagine the chaos that would follow? Let's find out, shall we? Springaling found it difficult to make new friends and often felt quite lonely, partly because he preferred dangling from hooks and nails and gently bouncing up and down, thinking about the old times. This is what most springs like to do, whereas other gadgets prefer living in boxes and tins, gossiping about other folks' business. Being a spring, of course, did mean he had a constant need to keep stretching himself, and a tendency to shake and quiver when he was talking to someone, which at times could be very annoying. So it came as a pleasant surprise when one morning he noticed a rather dejected-looking valve spring ambling along the bench, looking for all the world as if it had no intention of going anywhere in particular. "Hello!" shouted Springaling, who was dangling from his hook and gently bouncing up and down. "Are you looking for somebody?" "Me?" replied the valve spring, glancing round just to make sure it was he who was being spoken to. "Looking for somebody?" the valve spring went on. "Not that I can think of. It's just that you seem lost, or not quite sure which way to go," continued Springaling. "That's one way of putting it," replied the valve spring. "Please don't think I'm being nosy," blurted Springaling. "But what's the other way of looking at it?" "There ain't one," snapped the spring, gently quivering all over. "You see, what happened was this. I went to sleep last night wrapped up in a nice oily rag, but when I woke up it was gone." "What, the oily rag?" blurted Springaling, sounding surprised. "Yes, and all my friends. They left me on that draughty old window ledge and completely disappeared." "It sounds to me as if Morris Wainwright had a hand in that," replied Springaling, bouncing a little higher. "Who's Morris Fleabite?" queried the spring. "Wainwright," repeated Springaling, surprised that the valve spring had never heard of him. "This is his shed, and he's always collecting things that other people throw away." "Then he must be the bloke who asked Farmer Mudpond if he could have all his old valve springs from his tractor, because he said they may come in handy," replied the valve spring, nodding his head and quivering. "That definitely sounds like Morris Wainwright," replied Springaling. "So what do you think he's done with all my mates?" shouted the valve spring, stamping his foot and springing several inches into the air. "Put them in a box under his bed, that's my guess. Which means that you must be a reject, if you don't mind me saying," exclaimed Springaling. "Me? A reject?" snapped the spring. "I may be a bit weaker than I used to be, but I can still shove a valve back into its seat as good as the next fella." "Well, I think I can," he went on after a pause, sounding as if he was about to burst into tears. "Now there's no need to upset yourself, young fella," began Springaling, leaping from his hook and landing with a loud ping on the bench. "I know exactly how you feel. You see, I was once thrown into a rubbish skip as a useless old spring from a jack-in-a-box." "You?" blurted the valve spring, grabbing the peak of his cap and pulling it almost over his eyes. "A fine, strong spring like you?" "Until I was rescued by Morris Wainwright," continued Springaling. "So don't bother yourself about being a reject. Tell me what your name is, and you can be my friend." The old valve spring began to smile and quiver excitedly. "You can call me Mr. Whiskers." blurted the Spring, glancing shyly at Springaling. Mr. Whiskers, repeated Springaling. That's an unusual name for a spring, if you don't mind me saying, he went on, frowning and staring at a few spiky little whiskers sticking out of the old Valve Spring's chin, before repeating his name. Mr. Whiskers? But my real name is Quivering, blurted the Spring, after a pause. Quivering, replied Springaling, smiling. Now, that's a very nice springy sort of name. But I thought you said your name was Whiskers. Quivering Whiskers, gushed the Spring. That's what all the other Springs used to call me, just because I'm not as strong as they are. The little Spring continued, and they'd all laugh at me and shout nasty things like... Never mind what they shouted, snapped Springaling. They sound like bullies to me. You're my friend now, and I think the name Quivering Whiskers is a very nice name. So if you don't mind, I'll call you Quivering, and you can call me Springaling. The little Valve Spring soon found an old hook to dangle from, and could often be seen gently bouncing up and down, just like his new friend Springaling had shown him. Quivering soon met Rusty Nail and Sprocket, often joining them on the bench for a game of marbles or cricket, using the wickets and bats that Posh Fernie had shown them how to make from Morris Wainwright's old lolly sticks. Then one morning, a few days later, young Pinion rushed into the scrap box shouting, Rusty, Rusty, come and see what Mr. Whiskers has made for us. It's a trampoline. Trampoline? Repeated Rusty. Whatever are you talking about, Pinion? A trampoline, gasped Pinion, and I can almost bounce up to the roof. Goodness me, gasped Rusty, as she ran onto the bench, to see Wingsy almost crash into the eaves as he sprang off the old tobacco tin that Mr. Whiskers had covered with a large square piece of rubber, nailing each corner to the bench with a tin tack. But just then Rusty noticed the new inner tube that Morris had bought to repair his motorbike, laying on the bench, with a large square hole cut in it. Whatever is Morris going to say when he sees that? She gasped. How would I know? But this is a super trampoline. Look, Rusty, shouted Wingsy, as he bounced off the rubber and somersaulted 2 or 3 times before landing on his ears. But what about the inner tube? Yelled Sprocket, who had followed Rusty onto the bench. It's brand new. Morris has only just bought it. Look, there's the box it came in. Just at that moment, they noticed Peter Verney strolling along the bench, taking his morning stroll. Good morning, he began in his usual refined manner, before pointing at the large square hole in the inner tube with his cane. Goodness gracious me! That's the biggest puncher I've ever seen. It's not a puncher, Mr. Verney. Mr. Whiskers cut that out with his scissors, replied Pinion. Dearie, dearie me, gasped Peter, scratching his chin. Whatever did he do that for? To make us a trampoline, look. And it's really good fun, exclaimed Wingsy, bouncing so high that he struck his large ears on the shed roof with a loud clatter. And what did he say about the inner tube? Replied Peter, turning to young Pinion. Did he know that it will let all the air out when Morris Wainwright pumps it up? I think he did, Mr. Verney, exclaimed young Pinion, because he said that when he'd finished his breakfast he'd come back and cut a bigger piece out and stick it over the hole to stop it leaking. Ah, I see, replied Peter, screwing up his face. I suppose that should do it. But what about the new hole? Shouted Rusty. Won't that leak as well? Funnily enough, I was just thinking about that myself, replied Peter after a pause. So was I, interrupted Sprocket, in a thoughtful sort of voice. What he'll do then, I suppose, is cut out a bigger piece of rubber and repair that hole. Don't be ridiculous, Sprocket, shouted Rusty. That will only let even more of the air out. Will you all stop making such silly suggestions? Rusty went on, Can't you see that if we keep cutting bigger and bigger pieces of rubber out and sticking them over the last hole, in the end there won't be any inner tube left at all?" "Exactly," exclaimed Peter Verney, bouncing his cane loudly on the bench, and sniggering. "I was wondering when somebody would finally realise what a stupid idea that was." However, just at that moment they heard Springaling and his new friend Quivering bouncing along the bench. "I've just popped along to see the trampoline. My new friend Quivering has just been telling me how much fun young Pinion and Whimsy were having bouncing up and down on it." "Yes, we are, Springaling. You just watch me," shouted Pinion. "I can bounce right up to the roof." "So can I," blurted Whimsy, "and probably even higher than that if the roof wasn't there." "That's all very well," interrupted Sprocket, "but that doesn't help us think how we can repair Morris Wainwright's inner tube." "Surely Morris can do that himself, can't he, Sprocket?" said Springaling. "Isn't that why he bought a new one the other day?" "Yes, it is, Springaling," exclaimed Peter Verney. "But look, that's where your friend Mr. Whiskers cut out the rubber for the trampoline," he went on, pointing to the huge oblong hole in the tube with his cane. "Good gosh!" exclaimed Springaling. "Quivering didn't tell me about that." "And it's brand new," shouted Rusty. "Look, there's the box." "Well, well, well," said Springaling, nodding his head and pulling one of those faces that springs do when they can't think of anything else to say. "Well, well, well, I don't think Morris is going to be very happy about that. Maybe we should cut a bigger piece of rubber out of the tube and stick it over the hole, like a patch," Springaling went on excitedly. "Then Morris won't notice it." "Please, Springaling," blurted Rusty, "don't let's go through all that again. There must be another way." "I just hope we can think of it before Morris decides to repair his flat tire," said Sprocket. "I think I know how we could do it," piped up Quivering. "It's a pity I didn't think of it before." "You'd better leave it to us, Mr. Whiskers. Don't you think you've done enough damage for one day?" began Peter Verney in his schoolmasterly voice. "He's only trying to be friendly, Mr. Verney," snapped Wingsy Nut. "He probably noticed how bored we were playing marbles and cricket every day, and made us a trampoline so we could have some fun." "It won't be much fun, Wingsy, when Morris Wainwright finds out that we ruined his inner tube and throws us out of the shed," shouted Sprocket. I still think I know what we could do, Mr. Sprocket," repeated Quivering in a soft, quivery voice. "Oh, do stop interrupting, Mr. Whiskers. Can't you see we are all racking our brains to think of something?" blurted Peter Verney. "Perhaps we should listen to what Quivering has to say," interrupted Springaling. "Remember, he was the one who cut the hole in the inner tube in the first place." "That's true, Springaling," replied Peter Verney, shaking his head in despair, "and I don't suppose even he can make matters any worse." "Very well. What would you suggest we do to stop Morris Wainwright getting so angry he throws us all out of the shed and into the nearest dustbin?" said Peter, waving his cane in the air with a flourish and pointing through the window at the dustbin outside Morris Wainwright's kitchen door. "Well," began Quivering in a shaky sort of voice, "if I was to cut some tiny little teeth marks all the way round the hole, then Mr. Wainwright will think that it was a mouse that did it, and not us." No one spoke for several moments, and it was only the sound of Peter Verney clearing his throat that finally broke the silence. "How very strange," began Peter. "You appear to have taken the words right out of my mouth, young fellow. I was just about to say," Peter went on, "if we cut some little teeth marks, that should make Morris Wainwright think that it was a mouse that made the hole, and not us." "I didn't know mice had rubber inner tubes," blurted young Pinion. "Please be quiet, Pinion," shouted Rusty, "and think yourself lucky we have someone as clever as Peter to help us. That's what I say." "I thought it was Mr. Whiskers who thought of it first," exclaimed Wingsy. "Does it matter who thought of it first?" snapped Sprocket. "It sounds a jolly good idea to me." The next day being Saturday, they guessed that when Morris had finished his milk round, he would fit the new inner tube to his motor bike, so there was no time to waste. Mr. Whiskers agreed to start cutting the teeth marks as soon as he'd sharpened his scissors. He asked Pinion if he would hold the rubber tight to stop it slipping each time he made a snip, and by the time the sun went down, Mr. Whiskers had cut tiny teeth marks all the way round the hole. "That's it," exclaimed Quivering boastfully. "This Morris Wainwright friend of yours will think that some greedy little mouse made the hole and not us." "I think you mean you, Mr. Whiskers, not us," blurted Rusty, pointing her finger at him. "Remember, it was you that made the hole in the first place," she went on accusingly. "Well, he has put it right, Rusty, so I think we should stop blaming him now," exclaimed Springaling. "After all, he was only trying to be friendly." Saturday morning was fine and sunny. The church clock had just struck 7 when Morris found his bathing trunks and made himself some cheese sandwiches, then filled an old Tizer bottle with orange juice. His friends had planned a trip to the seaside, and they all intended to meet up on the market square in about an hour. So after gulping down his cornflakes and plastering down his hair with brill cream, he just needed to change the inner tube and force the tire back onto the wheel with the 2 dessert spoons he'd borrowed from the kitchen drawer. He rushed into the garden shed, carrying the front wheel from his motorbike, eager to get the new tube fitted. However, when he snatched the new tube off the bench, he could hardly believe what he was seeing, and had to squint several times just to be sure. Gasping with a strange frenzied croak, as if he had just dropped a smoothing iron on his big toe, he screamed, "Ah! Some ghastly pesky pest has gone and gobbled a massive hole in my brand new inner tube," staring in horror at the gaping oblong puncture, with tiny little teeth marks all the way round its edge. Slowly turning from his usual pimply white to a fiery red, Morris stomped around the shed, kicking everything he could reach with his Doc Martens, and striking everything he couldn't, including Mr. Verney's polished box with the dessert spoons. "Those horrible, pesky mice!" he screamed. "They've only gone and ruined my day on the beach." Propping open the shed door, he instantly began throwing everything onto the paving slabs outside, even the scrap-box, which landed on the concrete path with an ear-splitting clatter. "Goodness me!" gasped Rusty, grabbing young Pinion by his ears to stop him being catapulted onto the lawn. "I didn't expect this." "Nor did I," spluttered Sprocket, just as a large bucketful of rusty nuts and bolts crashed through the scrap-box roof and emptied a deluge of dirty orange-coloured water all over them. "Ah!" screeched Peter Verney, whose box lid had sprung open, allowing it to fill up with the acrid-smelling liquid. "I could have predicted something nasty like this was going to happen. Listening to that silly little valve spring," he gabbled. Soon dozens of paint tins and brushes littered the garden path, while boxes and biscuit tins of terrified hammers, spanners, and twist drills gazed out in despair as they were piled one on top of the other, while rusty oil cans and a twisted bicycle frame and a broken lawn-mower were balanced precariously on top of the growing heap. "Whatever is he doing, Rusty?" whispered Pinion, who was shaking violently. "Do you think he will throw us in the dustbin like Peter Verney said?" "I think he's looking for the mice," replied Rusty. "Or perhaps Mr. Whiskers," yelled Sprocket. "At least, he will be when he discovers that there aren't any mice living in the shed." Just then Morris Wainwright stumbled through the shed door, mumbling something that sounded rather like, "If it's those pesky mice, they must be darn good at hiding, that's all I can say." They didn't see Morris again until tea time, but heard his mother telling Mr. Giddings over the garden fence that she'd fetched him fish and chips with curry sauce for his dinner to try to cheer him up a bit. "He promised to put everything back in the shed and sweep up the mess," she was saying, "and next week I'm going to give him the money to buy a new inner tube and some mouse traps." Morris was as good as his word, and before his mum shouted down the garden to tell him his cocoa was ready, he'd swept the shed floor and put everything neatly back in its place. He'd even polished Peter Verney's box and given the old vernier a nice bath in bicycle oil. As for Springaling and his new friend, they kept themselves to themselves for several days after that, until one morning, a week or so later, when Rusty Nail happened to notice Mr. Whiskers sitting on the upturned flower pot on the window ledge, chatting to the old spider. "You'll never guess what that kind Mr. Whiskers was saying, Rusty." "Something nice, I hope," replied Rusty. "That's not going to send Morris Wainwright into another rage." "Oh, yes, very nice," began the old spider. "He said he'd been watching me dangling from my web, sunbathing, and thought to himself, wouldn't it be a good idea if he made me a little rubber hammock to lay in instead?" "Hammock?" gasped Rusty. "He wants to make you a rubber hammock? Perhaps I should have a word with Peter Verney about that first," replied Rusty, "just in case." In the meantime, however, it had come to light that Mr. Whiskers had the most unfortunate tendency to get bored very quickly and rush into things without thinking first. One reason, it was said, that he'd been removed from the old Farmer Mudpond's tractor. It appears that sometimes, even before they had got halfway across a field, he would become bored and begin amusing himself by telling some of the valves to stay open when they should be closed, or instruct others that should be closed to stay open. This would completely confuse the poor old tractor's engine until it hardly knew if it was coming or going. All it could do was cough and splutter and puff great black plumes of smoke from its exhaust pipe, driving poor old Farmer Mudpond into one of his rages. Finally, he instructed his mechanic to remove every valve from the tractor's engine and replace them with brand new ones. As you can imagine, this upset all the other valve springs, who refused to talk to Quivering Whiskers after that. So nobody was very concerned when a few days later Springaling came pinging along the bench, looking very sombre, not at all her usual smiley self. "I'm afraid I have some very bad news," he began, noticing Sprocket sitting in his deck chair. "Some very bad news indeed," continued Springaling, sounding as if he was about to start sobbing. "Bad news?" replied Sprocket, glancing up from his comic. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Springaling. Perhaps you should tell Rusty about it," he went on. "No, it was Rusty that told me," exclaimed Springaling. "She said that she was advising my friend Quivering not to tie the shed door handle to the bench leg with the clothesline." "To the bench?" gasped Sprocket, putting down his comic. "Whatever would he want to do that for? Or perhaps he was just bored." "Quivering said it was to stop Morris Wainwright bursting in and surprising everybody," replied Springaling. He told Rusty that Morris Wainwright would have to knock on the shed door first and wait outside until we let him in. Gosh, blurted Sprocket, I don't think Morris Wainwright would like that very much. I mean, having to knock on his own shed door and wait outside until we let him in. No, I don't think Mr. Verney liked it either, Sprocket, because he shouted at Quivering, telling him to behave himself, or he'd better find another shed to live in, replied Springaling. Did he really, replied Sprocket, tell him to find another shed to live in? Yes, he did, blurted Springaling. But Quivering just put his tongue out and threw himself on the floor like a naughty child, blocking up his ears with his fingers. Crikey, that must have made Peter Verney angry, gasped Sprocket. Very angry, Sprocket. In fact, Mr. Verney pointed his walking stick at him and told him that he'd heard about badly behaved valve springs like him before, and they always came to a sticky end. Gosh, did that stop Mr. Whiskers behaving like a naughty spring? Asked Sprocket. No, it did not, Sprocket, said Springaling, beginning to sob loudly. Quivering just shouted, Who cares? This is a stupid old shed anyway. Nobody can have any fun without being bossed around by a boring old vernier or a rusty nail. Really, said Sprocket, looking quite shocked. And what did your friend Quivering do then, Springaling? What did my friend do then? Blurted Springaling, with big tears rolling down his face. He stuck his tongue out again at Mr. Verney and bounced through the hedgehog flap, and I don't suppose I'll ever see him again.
Well, do cheer up, Springaling, Sprocket reassured him with a smile. I'm sure that's not the last we'll see of Mr. Quivering Whiskers. Thank you for spending a little time with us in the old garden shed. If you'd like to hear more adventures with Rusty Nail and her friends, we'd love you to subscribe. Until next time, sleep well and keep smiling.